So good afternoon and welcome. I'm Rosalind Layton, a visiting fellow here at the George Mason University National Security Institute. Today's event is 5G to 6G, International Perspectives on U.S. Spectrum Leadership and National Security. So in the United States, we sometimes take our technological leadership for granted. And that may have worked in the past, but it seems today that that may not be such a smart position. We've assembled an amazing panel today to talk about the national security perspectives of our 5G leadership and what is it going to take to continue that, and what are the challenges in front of us. As many probably know, they've experienced commercial mobile wireless service through 4G. It's brought U.S. economy millions of jobs, hundreds of billions of dollars in economic growth. And now with 5G, it's poised to do even more. And already the United States is leading the world in 5G adoption, upwards of 60%. This is really a surge in people who want to have fast, reliable, and secure networks. At the same time, we find ourselves in a precarious position where almost the unthinkable, the authority of the Federal Communications Commission to conduct an auction has lapsed. Perhaps the single most important policy innovation is not possible unless it gets reauthorized by Congress. If the most recent, we've had auctions beginning in 1994, they've brought the United States Treasury some $250 billion, staggering amount of money, tremendously important to drive efficiency and responsible use of our scarce resources. And the ideas of auctions have been so valuable, they have been taken up in many other fields for ways to allocate scarce resources. In fact, the FCC's auction designers were recognized with a Nobel Prize just 2 or 3 years ago. But in spite of all that, we have an empty spectrum pipeline, and policymakers across the board are wondering what are the next steps. In addition, the United States is not the only game in town. There are serious international competitors who want to lead the world in apps and technologies and wireless and so on. We're going to talk about that today. And in fact, this fall, the World Radio Conference is bringing everyone together to talk about spectrum harmonization. And that is a very important issue. So in today's, we've pulled together an amazing panel for all of you, and we're going to hear from each of them and then have a discussion. We'll take some of your questions from the audience. We have Clete Johnson, who is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Security and International Studies. We have Kim Larson, who's an international spectrum and wireless industry executive and entrepreneur, who's going to talk about international spectrum strategies. We have Jeffrey Wells, also a visiting fellow here at the at NSI. He is going to lay out what he sees as a person working formerly with the United States Navy and one who advises policymakers about national security, how he sees the situation. And we have also from George Mason University, Brent Skurup, who is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center, who has been working well over a decade studying spectrum policy in the US and providing constructive ideas and policy solutions. So I'm going to kick it off today. We're going to go to Clete, who has a series of papers about 5G and our spectrum challenges. And he's looking at China. He is looking at lessons learned from our past experiences. And it's not only the spectrum auction itself, which has been so important in the US policy, it's within US policy, but it's been the ability to recover and reuse and refarm spectrum in new ways. The incentive auctions, the C-band auction, which took earlier a satellite spectrum, recovered it for 5G. And looking at different solutions for how to find spectrum which was lightly used or not well used to make it available for commercial purposes. That's really important. Before I turn to you, Clete, I want to share with you just something I found interesting. You know, when I was doing my PhD on mobile app economy, I already saw in 2015 that Chinese apps were beginning to grow in the US economy. And it's quite interesting because American app providers have been blocked from the Chinese market for well over 20 years. But if you look at China today, they have really the dream test bed if you want to build a mobile app. They have beachfront spectrum. They have their, their leading equipment makers, the leading phone makers. They have three well-capitalized operators who have the best spectrum, and they have 1 billion people with top-end devices. So if you want to deploy an app, you don't have a better test bed than that. And we now see TikTok, 150 million users in the United States, and an associated set of Chinese apps growing in the US economy. They don't follow our rules in the United States, don't follow our privacy practices, data protection, data goes to the Chinese government. And yet we have a completely asymmetrical regulatory framework for this. And it's been very hard for policymakers to deal with. So, when I think about the next president of the United States, it's probably a youngster using TikTok today. It really concerns me, and I think it should concern our audience, particularly because when we look at their setup for mobile wireless and how the government has basically put everything in place to let their companies lead and drive the 5G and 6G, and then where are we today here in the US? So I'd love to hear from you, and please give us your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Rosalind, and thanks to the other to NSI and George Mason and other panelists for making this possible. I think you teed it up very well, and this is something that both in my think tank life at CSIS and also in private practice working in telecommunications, 5G security. It's something that has been the primary focus of personally and professionally in recent decades. I think just to tie these two concepts together, spectrum is obviously for those of us who can't see radio waves moving through the air. Spectrum is an abstract. Is something that is abstract to us as human beings. So to make it a little bit more concrete, I think you might look at spectrum as one of the key natural resources for 5G, and we'll unpack that a little bit and talk about what we mean by that. But allocating spectrum efficiently and in the amounts necessary to maintain U.S. and allied innovation is maybe looking at it as a natural resource is the best way to conceptualize that. And because with your lead in on TikTok, kind of at the forefront, it's my belief that if market democracies do not, and specifically led by the United States, as sort of the quarterback market democracy in the world, whether it's the G7 or NATO or other groups. If market democracies do not lead the 5G, the innovation of the 5G era, then there's no doubt that China will, and that means that autocracies will. And the reason that matters is because the ubiquitous connectivity that comes with 5G, totally new. It's not just an upgrade in telephones. 5G is about ubiquitous connectivity with various sensors, be it in an agricultural field or setting, or an industrial setting, in an office setting, in a transportation setting. 5G is about connecting everything, and it brings the cyber physical worlds together in a way that has never existed in history. It will also create more digital data, exponentially more digital data than has ever existed in human history, or let's call it galactic history. We've never had that much data, and therefore that much capability for, on the one hand, if you're a market democracy, for freedom of expression, for innovation, for dynamism, for technological and commercial innovation, and everything that can come with that. On the other hand, that exponentially more data than ever before in human history can lead to more social control and suppression and autocratic control than has ever existed before. So I really see this as this issue as something that is almost existential for market democracies, because if authoritarian states, primarily like the People's Republic of China, control the 5G world, then if they lead in 5G, then they will have capabilities that go beyond what our capabilities will be, particularly with regard to AI, quantum computing, cyber capabilities, therefore information operations, and can really, we won't get into 6G yet, but especially as we move into a 6G world, that will really control the lived environment that we all experience. And that is, again, existential. And so the core issue that I've been arguing in my work as an advocate and as a senior fellow at CSIS, is that commercial strength, in a way that is different in kind from previous times, where national security was based on armies and weapons and protecting physical borders or advancing past physical borders. We're now in an era where commercial strength, which has always underlied America's national security, from World War II and the arsenal of democracy to the Cold War, and as I often give this anecdote, as a young lieutenant in the late 90s, serving first in South Korea and next in Germany, which had just recently been West Germany. You can tell the difference between the security of a society and its commercial strength, based on looking across the DMV into North Korea or looking at the former East Germany. Commercial strength is security, and this is something that we need to keep in mind as we develop our spectrum policy. We right now have a pretty drastic shortage of spectrum available for 5G, for commercial 5G applications in the United States, particularly in the mid-band, which, as many of our viewers may know, is sort of the ideal mix of the ability to carry traffic and the ability to carry it for a long distance. And that mid-band, there is a severe mid-band spectrum gap between the United States and China. And it's something that, in my view, threatens our national security in a very real way, not in sort of an intangible, we need economic growth, et cetera, but in a tangible way that might be summarized best as, if China leverages the spectrum gap to lead in 5G, they will also lead the development of technical standards. They will lead the development of new products and new applications, as Rosalind mentioned. And that leads almost in a linear fashion to a Chinese national champion like Huawei or TikTok, dominating essentially every sector of the global economy. If that happens, there is no, as I've written, there is no weapon system, mitigation measure, rip and replace proceeding. There's no way for us to protect our security interests if Chinese national champions dominate every sector of the global economy. So that's, to me, that's what the stakes are. And so the three things that we need to have spectrum authority reauthorized so the FCC can auction new spectrum. We need to have coherent government processes, including coordinating with allies, but also intragovernmental government processes to free up and then deploy 5G. And then we need to have deep collaboration between industry and government to make that work. Too often we see spectrum as a zero-sum game, and it instead needs to be one of collaboration to maximize government and including DoD and weapons systems use of spectrum and increase spectral efficiency. And number two, to flood our economy with commercial innovations that will drive the future. So I hope I haven't gone on too long. I will turn it over to my fellow colleagues.
Well, thank you for teeing that up. And we want to get a link out to your forthcoming papers. You have one already with CS. I know you write for them, but I think they're quite relevant. So thank you for that. You said it so well. I'm going to turn to Dr. Kim Larson. You have a PhD in physics, and you can certainly enlighten us. I think what's interesting to me about all of the things that you have, that you might touch upon. If we look at 5G, when we talk about efficiency of 5G and spectrum, not just spectral efficiency, but the security, in the US, our ability, because we've had auctions, we have forced the market players to be efficient. We've driven something on the order of a 42x efficiency improvement in the spectrum for commercial wireless, which is astounding. Nowhere, the government users who don't have those kinds of requirements, they don't have price signals, they don't have those needs to be efficient in the same way. So they kind of use the spectrum the same way they have for a long time. And then similarly, if we look at unlicensed users, again, no price signal to force them to be more efficient. So, you see things like wanting to have more and more unlicensed spectrum rather than saying, how can you use the spectrum you have more efficiently? So just a side note, you might find interesting, Dr. Larson, I was told, that the metaverse was going to be this play for, it was going to be over fiber to the home on Wi-Fi. That was the whole idea. But I understand now that metaverse is largely being used on mobile because the security is better. And you need to have good security if you want to be in a metaverse for those reasons. And 5G standards have security baked in, whether it's the protection from the DDoS attacks, whether it's the encryption standards, the cloud security standards, the slicing capabilities, the zero trust authentication at every step along the way. You just don't get that when you use an unlicensed technology. So part of what you get when you take a 3GPP technology is you're getting the security built in. So it's sort of like warm water. There's hot and cold in it. You can't separate it. That's just the way it is. So I'd love it if you'd share, your perspective as a, mobile industry executive who's working on this issue, both in the US and abroad. You understand the allied perspective, of course.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me for this event. So it's a great honor. So one of the perspectives I've had on the US is basically a stranger in a strange land, being used to European spectrum policy, which is very neat, very uniform. I remember coming to the US probably somewhere in 2011 or something like that, and watching the fragmentation of spectrum across every CMA, and then thinking, what's going on here, and asking all the typical European, probably regarded as stupid questions about why you're doing this and why you're doing that. But I must also admit, if I look over time, and I've been following the US market since, again, 2011 or something like that, maybe even before that time, you have also come a long way in terms of the quality you actually give the American consumer. And it's not because you had a lot of spectrum to do it with. You have built out network coverage is substantially better than it was 10 years ago. And a lot of that is also to bring more capacity to the market. If you look at the frequency that now is in use for 5G and for 4G in the US, is starting to be at the European level, maybe a little bit less spectrum in the low frequency band, but in general, you're at the same level. And also, if you look at the quality that is provided to the American consumer, is maybe not as high as some of the top countries in the world, which would be South Korea, Norway, Netherlands. But it's really improved a lot, particularly after 5G has been launched in the US. And I think that's really amazing. As a physicist, I always say that actually quality capacity in a cellular network is super easy. It's the amount of bandwidth you have available. It's times the spectral efficiency, where a lot of the innovations sit. I mean, as you just pointed out, or you tried to point out, I think, was that, well, if I have a gigahertz of bandwidth, I can have a very poorly efficient technology. I will still deliver quite a good quality, what is expected to at a consumer end, right? But what really is important is that you work on the efficiency. You're getting more bits, you're getting more quality out per hertz that you have available. And of course, the last element of creating a fantastic network is the number of sites. But economically, and often actually practically, particularly where you need the capacity, this becomes more and more difficult, or you need to go to small cells, which also economically is doubtful. So we need a lot of innovation in the spectral efficiency, as you pointed out, and I think most of us have pointed out also in the papers to the NTI on the spectrum roadmap. But of course, you also need spectrum. I mean, I remember the times where we looked into the particular T-Mobile US, where we were afraid that, hey, they're running out of capacity within the next 5 years. What are we going to do? Well, at least if you look at the T-Mobile US, it was quite clear what they had to do. But it's always been feeling that it's just a matter of time. You're running out of capacity, and then the only option really is to build more sites, which either is not possible or economically rather unpractical. So I think the good news is that US has really made a big step in quality to the consumer. But we also know that with the vast amount of spectrum, I have to be careful with my accent here, vast amount of spectrum that is either being shared or on federal use. I mean, that's really needed. We expect that with end of 2030, we need 2 gigahertz alone for 5G. And then 6G comes around, which has even more requirements to bandwidth. It's just not there today. And we need to have a consistent plan for how do we get that on a per operator basis. And C-band is great, it's a good start, but we all know the C-band, particularly in the US, is challenged in many areas of the whole C-band due to CBRS and due to sharing, etc. So we need more spectrum, and in order to get more spectrum, you probably need to go up. And I think that is a discussion about the 6 up. So what I call the beach fund for me goes up to 7 gigahertz. I know in the US it typically stops around 3.7, but I think you need to go up there because that's the only way you can consistently get a 2 gigahertz bandwidth for the services and the quality we expect going forward. And on security, 5G is amazing, and it's built in with the thought of that. And there, in particular, what you should be concerned about is with federal services that today is making use of spectrum, they would probably be better off, at least from a communication service perspective, to actually go to a 5G network and use slicing as a mean to create a much higher level of security than today. Of course, end devices are always problematic, right? You need to be sure you have the right end devices for the real security, but nevertheless. So I think you come in US, I'm really impressed with how far the quality and what we offer consumers there, but we need to grow. There is also a future that needs to be considered. And I would be very concerned, I think you made a brilliant comment that the Chinese market, they have tremendous scale challenge for their technology, which forces them to think about much more aggressive spectral efficiency solutions because there are just so many and they're so concentrated. And even if they have millions and billions of sites, which probably creates one of the most densest network around, they still need a lot of bandwidth and they need certainly to work on their efficiency. And I think we need to figure out from a Western perspective, US perspective, where is our innovation focus? And that will be on spectral efficiency, in particular in US, I think is a fantastic area because with all the spectrum today on federal use, you cannot just skip that because it's important use, it's on national security use. But how do you coexist with commercial exploitance of that spectrum? CBRS, I think, is a good start, certainly better than some of the European solutions, but it also should force us from a national security and from a technology perspective to create much more spectral efficiencies what today is in federal use.
Well, thank you for that. Well, I think that leads very well to our next panelist, Jeffrey Wells, who's also a visiting fellow here at NSI. You must quickly get to the skiff and check out his column there. It's excellent reading. And Jeffrey Wells has served in communications in the U.S. Navy and has a deep background in this area. And I have asked him to lay out for us 3 scenarios that our current status quo in spectrum policy of how it's creating risks for us. So, but Jeffrey, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic.
Sure. Thank you very much, Rosalind, and thanks to Clete and to Kim for setting up the conversation so far. And I agree with you on one of the. I was thinking as we were talking, Kim, of the spectrum allocation map that you look here in the U.S. It's like a Jackson Pollock painting, and trying to make sense of that while trying to think about how we're going to innovate and secure it is incredibly complex. Just by just visually, not to mention getting into the actual science and then the execution of it. And as we both of you highlighted, the current our current spectrum allocation model really is a hoarding model, and it creates I think significant risks and vulnerabilities and threats. Even if we were to reauthorize the auctioning of spectrum, I know as late as December of last year, the DoD expressed concern for that and wanted to reserve significant amounts of the spectrum for their own use, which I think is interesting as they rely on commercial innovation and commerce in general to support them going forward. I think the three kind of risks, if I there's so many, but I'm trying to boiling them down. First is that I think we've already at this point kind of surrendered to foreign vendor reliance in both 4G, 5G, and even into next G spaces, and that the current status quo of that has led to reliance, especially from China, say Huawei, ZTE, and 5Com, and I think we're all challenged to kind of think of many U.S. companies besides Cisco and Qualcomm. There's Nokia and Nokia and Ericsson, but not too many that are the leaders. And trying to get the Chinese out of this space is a bit like trying to weed a garden. I think at this point, it's you can pull one up, you come up the next day, and then in the complicated supply chain of service providers, you don't even know who's further down there, and that does raise concerns for me from the potential to backdoors and vulnerabilities in the network infrastructure. There's so much that we don't know about how the various pieces from down to the end device or the endpoint chipset to the very complicated aspects of the network infrastructure, and I think those could be used both for cyber attacks or for espionage, and or for ultimately to just disrupt the network in general. And I think that addressing these vulnerabilities requires further advancement of our domestic vendors and reducing the dependence on those foreign suppliers. But we need more in our ecosystem in the West, certainly to secure our national security and ensure it. I think that leads to obviously the second piece, which is the cyber and kinetic risks, and I think that cyber is much more than sort of the ether that Clete sort of talked about as well. It is physical. It has real physical impacts, and the high data speeds and connectivity offered by the current mobile networks and the use of 5G, 4G, and whatever next G may be, has incredibly complicated cybersecurity risks, because we've not even yet adequately addressed the vulnerabilities that exist in the older networks, and to begin to think about that the great partnerships between 3GPP and the ITUR has been wonderful, and the involvement of NIST in developing those. But I think we really need to get ahead of the vulnerabilities from the critical infrastructure and data integrity, and ensuring privacy, and reducing critical vulnerability risks to concepts like security by design, zero trust, through strong international standards to reduce those cyber physical risks and ensure resiliency measures and a robust infrastructure and ecosystem should be prioritized from the beginning. And I think that we've kind of already surrendered that, as I said, in existing ones. And I think some of our emerging security challenges for 6G or next G, which is certainly in the early stages, which I think is a great time to think about how best to roadmap forward. And given innovation, everyone likes to move fast and break things, but I think that this is a space where we do need to maybe work fast and break things, but understand where our guardrails are. And by putting in some of those security by design concepts and best practices and norms for the use of it, I think we can get ahead of things, especially at the rate, if you had asked people last year, talk about artificial intelligence, nobody would be talking about it today. But here we are, almost 6 months into it, and I think it's a reality, whether we like it or not. So really, large language models, we're getting closer to real, to AI, to quantum, to next G, and I think those create that interconnectedness in higher frequencies and other things that are possible. The innovation that's coming are going to create a whole host of new vulnerabilities and risks that we can't even fathom at the moment. From autonomous cyber attacks to higher attack surfaces because of the density with which we have to operate currently, and if we don't think differently about spectrum, and then I think that this proactive approach is certainly is essential for current 5G, and as I think as Kim mentioned, if and Clete, were we to adopt 5G as a whole right now, I think that we'd be better off than trying to secure some of the backwards things. But I think as we look at 6G and XG standards, we've really got to get ahead of that instead of treating it kind of as a zero-sum game. And as a Navy guy, I would be remiss, if I'm not saying is that spectrum to me is much like the oceans, and to borrow from Alfred Thayer Mahan, is that you can't protect the entire ocean, so we can't secure all spectrum, but we should be thinking about those key the key things that are important to our national security, important to innovation, important to commerce, essential to commerce, and be thinking about it from that perspective. And I think that we can find a way to share spectrum efficiently and effectively with our government partners instead of looking at it again as a zero sum. And so I'll pause there because I know I kind of can ramble on for hours.
No, that was perfect. That was just exactly what I was hoping for. So thank you, Jeffrey. So I'm going to turn to Brent because we're going to tee you up on the topic of sharing. And for me, it strikes me as, sharing spectrum, it sounds like one of these wonderful policy promises. But I think as you've highlighted so well, in 20 years, we've talked about it a lot. It hasn't really happened. And yet things that we have, maybe not described so well have actually happened in terms of the repurposing of spectrum through market-based methods. So I'm curious, you've thought deeply about this. You've worked with a lot of other scholars who have studied spectrum and these various models. Would you give us your thoughts on, where is the proper place for spectrum? And, where's the proper place for sharing? And if not, what are the alternatives and how do we get there?
Yeah, thanks, Rosalind, and thanks for the invite. Great to be part of this great panel. Yeah, if I may, just at the outset for this audience, talk a little bit about the stakes when it comes to correct or good spectrum policy. As I think, as the other panelists have made clear, spectrum policy it's hard to imagine modern life without smartphones, without modern phones. Probably almost everyone on this call has carried a smartphone on their person almost every day for over a decade. And if you've ever forgotten your phone, as I have a couple times, it's really disorienting. It's how we stay in touch with family, our employers, makes us more connected. But also it's used, not just for leisure. I'll probably watch Chicago Cubs baseball on my phone tonight, but it's a huge part of the U.S. economy and the emerging tech sectors, all kinds of niche and industrial uses of spectrum. And I've been on panels, spectrum panels over the years, and there's a sense that wireless carriers, I hear the sentiment that wireless carriers are just whining and trying to grab some, this valuable asset from other users to make a few more dollars a month. I think it's much larger than that. The Chinese government can be accused of many things. I don't think they can be accused of caving to the commercial interests of commercial companies. I mean, I think they're quite clear-eyed about the importance of spectrum for their population, for their economy. And I think it was announced yesterday, Chinese regulators are going to open up the 6 gigahertz band, this very valuable mid-band to 5G and 6G uses. So I think they're quite clear-eyed about it in a way we might not always be, about the importance of this. So getting to sharing versus exclusive use. So NTIA put out a proceeding a few months ago, and NTIA governs federal spectrum uses and nominally including military spectrum uses, although in practice it's not clear how much power they actually have over military spectrum uses. But so they're looking for a national spectrum policy, and they raise this prospect: do we continue with this traditional role of clearing legacy users and auction it to the commercial carriers, or do we look towards new technologies and dynamic sharing of spectrum? I should add, sharing covers a lot of types of spectrum uses. I want to focus in on dynamic, or what's called opportunistic sharing. This is different spectrum users using spectrum in the same location at the same time: radar, Wi-Fi, cellular, satellite. And just put it bluntly, I'm very skeptical of this being leaned on as a way out of our spectrum scarcity. You said it's been talked about for 20 years. It's been talked about for 30 years. NTIA in 1991 started talking about dynamic spectrum sharing in earnest. And to date, outside of laboratories, I mean, it's just really not used very extensively. So I'm all for testing, funding new technology. I think it's worthwhile, but I would be very hesitant. I think it would be a mistake for U.S. policymakers to use this magic wand of dynamic spectrum sharing to make our spectrum issues go away. I think we still have more. I think traditional clearing, licensing, auctioning spectrum is a better model for the foreseeable future. And even those who promote dynamic spectrum sharing, like President Obama's PCAST report, note, I mean, it would take decades to do this correctly. So, I'll just wrap up by a possible way forward, and that is, so the DoD CIO a few months ago. So in 2021, Congress instructed DoD study a certain band, 3.1, and consider clearing some of that. The DoD CIO last year, I can't quote him, but paraphrasing, said, "Okay, we'll do it. It will take us 2 decades to clear it, and it will cost you hundreds of billions of dollars, but we'll look into it." I mean, so you can read between the lines. There's a lot of resistance to clearing, and frankly, they're not wrong in that they don't get. It's almost all pain, little gain for them to clear spectrum and make room for commercial carriers. So I've proposed, and others have proposed, give agencies a larger cut of spectrum proceeds, make it worth their while. And I think you can have win-win-win opportunities where carriers get new spectrum, Treasury gets new revenue, and a cut of proceeds goes to not just DoD, but also other federal users to upgrade their systems. A lot of these radar systems are like Cold War era relics, and I think you can have win-win-win opportunities, but you do, I think, have to give federal users and agencies a bigger cut of auction proceeds. So I'll leave that there, but it's no spectrum policy. I think the Chinese and the American government are pretty clear-eyed about the stakes, the importance of spectrum for not just expression and human liberty, but also businesses and the economic sector. And I hope people will not go hastily into the the promise of dynamic spectrum sharing. I think there's still room to go on clearing users, upgrading their technology, and giving them a sweeter deal.
Well, thank you for that, Brent. I'd love to get some reactions for our panel, but before we do, I think it's maybe just helpful to restate, because I know we got a lot of people listening. So we have sort of maybe 2 or 3 models in the running, and the different actors are competing to have spectrum allocated in different ways. So for example, the traditional way it was done before the auction was sort of what we called the beauty contest. You know, you'd go before the authority and say, I'd like to have the spectrum to do X, Y, Z. And you get that grant from the authority, and there you don't pay for it, but you sort of promise to deliver. And so that's sort of, that's the way it works with unlicensed spectrum, essentially 1200 gigahertz, here you go, off and running. That's very different than a market-based auction where you have a competition for the spectrum through, where different parties are going to bid based upon a geographic area. So the C-band auction, for example, 250 megahertz raised gross $90 billion. It's like 81 billion going to the Treasury. So you could see that little bit of spectrum could create huge revenues because it's so scarce and had exclusive use, high enough power, and so on. And then there's this other model about sharing. If the agencies don't want to give it up, remember, they haven't paid for it. What Brent is talking about is some financial incentive for them, because they can't really sell it as such, but could they be incentivized with a payment from those who want to use it, who are going to use it more efficiently? Could that work? And then the sharing is sort of something in between. Can connect technology allow us to, let's say they're only using 1% of 100% of their holdings. Could the other 99% be used efficiently? I think I don't know if I've got that correctly, but, so that's what's at stake. And I think what our panel wanted to say is, when we look at China, they're not putting so much stock into sharing. They're basically saying 6 gigahertz, this is going to go for commercial 5G. It's too important to us. We see the value of having large spectrum maps, and we're not just handing this over to unlicensed users. You do whatever you want, and so forth. Not that they have they're not conducting auctions as such, but they're clear about being on this roadmap for 5G, 6G, and so forth. In any case, Kim, I know you probably have a comment here from our panel. What would please share?
Yeah, no, I found Brent's comment about sort of Cold War radar systems. I mean, sort of a little bit what I sense from afar. I mean, if you look at the CBRS and the way that's done, it's done to protect legacy radar systems. And particularly if you look at the sensor network that's deployed along the coast, it's basically so conservatively designed because these radar systems are, well, would just be better safe than sorry, where I see no incentive for federal and particularly within the Department of Defense to actually innovate on the radar systems. It is possible to do dual use where you both use radar and you use communication system together. I think that's probably what Brent would call dynamic spectrum sharing to some extent, or even system sharing. And I see that creating more pressure for higher degree of innovation, particularly within the Department of Defense, is super important. If you look at, I think at the moment, there are 3 main research projects going on within DoD, and 2 of them have to do with spectrum or antenna design, but it doesn't, I mean, if you look at the amount of money that's been allocated to that, it seems more to be a kind of hobby research work than real serious work. I might do completely injustice to that, but I think you need to create an incentive for also innovating this. And I think that's a big difference from China, which are innovating in this space much more than we see in the US. And that's a pity.
That's such a good point. I mean, from my perspective, when I look at CBRS, you just have, it's low power, or you can't use the full power of 5G, so you can't really properly use it for 5G. And then the other part is from the licensing basis, they have some priority license with it. It brings just a fraction of the, dollar value per megahertz, so maybe 70 cents on the dollar that you get with 5G. I mean, so for example, a 5G, the pound per pound, and you'd get 4 to 5 times as much money through your 5G as you would through Wi-Fi, all things being equal. But in a similar mid-band area, you're just going to get more money for your economy because you can deliver a better quality service, more performance, more secure apps, this kind of thing. But before, I want to come back to our military person for the panel. Jeffrey, please.
I don't know.
Please give us some thoughts.
Yeah, not so much sure that it's a sort of a military perspective, but it is listening both to Brent and to Kim. I was thinking about the Chinese government's actual policy for spectrum. And I'm actually is that I'm going to read it here is the purposes of the overall development of telecommunication information, the frequencies shall be harmoniously and effectively shared, and that's their policy. And and here we are talking about a very complicated, whether I don't know how they actually do it. I'm not going to say that, but since that's what they say, we don't have anything that similar in any of our documents. I mean, you look, through the FCC or NTIA or other, things. We're not that straightforward, and we don't talk about the sharing, and certainly there is a national security need here, and that we have some aged infrastructure that we need to replace. There's the opportunity that Brent mentioned for us to have incentives to do it, and by opening it up, I mean the innovation happens when things are open, and so the legacy systems to replace them may not be as expensive as we think, because innovation may come. And so through that, through those two, I think we have a future. And I think it's kind of, especially now more and more, where maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago, the leader was, the military. They were often the ones who had the projects through DARPA and elsewhere that were very creative and innovative. But we're in an age now where commercial innovation is leading the way, both in space and in spectrum and in others. And we need to kind of get out of their way. And the Department of Defense, we need them certainly. But we're here. They're here to serve us, not the other way around. Even though there's kind of a market piece there. So I'll pause, let Clete jump in.
Thank you for that. Well, I want to turn to Clete because I think he has such a unique background on this, having served both at the FCC and the security role, or cybersecurity, if I'm not mistaken, as well as Department of Commerce. So you've been on that side of being from the perspective of the government, or wanting to, I think you probably understand the challenges from industry, different parts of industry, as you know, and then also the federal actors who are naturally risk averse. So, how do you see the solutions here? And turn on your microphone.
I was muted. My apologies. And I also just add that before I moved into the FCC and commerce world, I spent my entire life in the U.S. Army and in the intelligence community. And the folks, I love the U.S. Army. I don't need to go into that, but the Department of Defense and in the intelligence community, our national security agencies of government, they see real threats every day. They wake up every morning and they try to protect America from real threats. And in many cases, they are clear and present threats that are not, a decade away. They're right here and now. And what I'm hoping we can do in the next this crucial next year or two is recognize that this spectrum, while it is a finite resource, it need not be a zero-sum resource. And something you said, because it's crucial we have to have the weapon systems and then all the civilian applications, and not just what NOAA does with regard to the weather and many other things. All of these government functions are very important. But we have to have those continue to operate at the level that we expect. But then I wonder, just going back to a stat that you raised right at the beginning, Rosalind, that the spectral efficiency of commercial wireless networks are now, I think it's 42 times, not 42%, 42 times the efficiency that existed just 10 years ago. And the question that begs for me is, what if every government system, every weapon system, every user of spectrum could realize 42 times gains in spectral efficiency? Really, what that means is this finite resource is now 42 times bigger. And so it just strikes me that where a lot of that dynamism and innovation is going to come from is from commercial innovators, as opposed to big programmatic, government contractors, which also have, the reason we got to the moon is because of those people, but they're innovative as well. But a lot of these dynamic innovations in spectral efficiency are going to come from the commercial sector. So it's actually good for the government. It can be a win-win if there's a positive feedback loop of innovation that then serves the government and gives them a lot more spectrum than they had before. Because so long, it's still a finite resource, but it's, if it's 42x the efficiency, that's a lot more spectrum than you had when you started.
Absolutely. Well, I think that the amount of federal spectrum that's at play, I think it's 40% of the, what's available. It's quite a large amount. But maybe I want to turn to you, Brent. This idea of, we don't have to have 42x efficiency to have a good improvement. I mean,
right.
5, 10, 20x, listen, we'll take it. It would be great. But Brent, I'm curious your thoughts, because I think your paper, which you outlined, and again, I think people go to the NTIA National Spectrum Strategy website. I think everybody here has filed something, or most of the people, as opposed to, I don't know if you can force the federal users to be more efficient. I think what you're saying is turn it over to whoever is efficient. Do you see, based upon what you've heard so far, what incentives, what's there for the, what's in it for the federal users to cooperate?
Yeah. And I should add, the federal users are not they're not a uniform
They're not
bunch.
monolithic, for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, the Clinton administration, they tried to consolidate spectrum management over military alone, and then that fell apart after a year. I mean, the branches of the military didn't they wanted their own independence over spectrum management. So where I agree with the defense and federal users is that, we probably are approaching the end of days where Congress can just mandate them to clear out and make way. Where I don't agree is that, they're at the max efficiency. They can't slim down anymore. I don't think that's true. And we know that's not true because, there were some circumstances, say 10 years ago, when, T-Mobile acquired some federal spectrum, and I can't remember the agency, but there's some systems they didn't even know they had. I mean, T-Mobile had to go to them and tell them to shut it off because they didn't even know they had it. And that's just the reality that when you don't have valuation of your system, which they don't. Just give you an example. A couple years ago, a small sliver of federal spectrum was sold in AWS-3 auction, about 25 megahertz. That's less than 0.5% of federal spectrum. It's sold for $20 billion. This sliver of federal spectrum sold for $20 billion. So they have extremely valuable asset, and I think even many in government don't understand how valuable it is if it were exposed to market forces. And I think the first step is just getting a very rough valuation. And I think even that would be enlightening for everyone.
Excellent. Well, I would love to continue this panel. I think we have so much to share. I didn't get to all of my questions. I know we have more audience questions, but we're coming to the end of our time. I hope that we'll be able to come back again and continue the discussion. But before we close out, I do want to take a moment to thank Alexander Toki at NSI, who did a wonderful job to put this together and did all the work so we could have the attendees today. I want to thank Jamil Jaffer, who runs our center and does a great job all over the place getting our name out there and keeping security at top of mind of policymakers. And we'll certainly try to make the papers available. And you can certainly suggest you make sure you go to the SCIF, SCIF. It's the journal that we have. It's online magazine for NSI. You can go to NTIA National Spectrum Strategy page. You'll see, I don't know, 100 or so filings from all across the board, including Brent is there, Dr. Larson is there, myself. I think Clete is there for sure. He's got a series coming out has one already, but the series coming out about China and mid-band spectrum. Certainly check that out at CSIS.org, if I'm not mistaken. And I want to make sure I've got everyone that you're covered. We have just a minute or two left, and I would love to do a lightning round. If there is something that you want to, a point that you want to make to leave with our audience, can you please share it in 30 seconds? So Jeffrey, I want to start with you.
I'm going to start with is lead with innovation and have built-in security going forward, standards-based security.
Thank you. Clete.
Just this basic point that commercial strength and vitality is the bedrock of security.
Excellent. Excellent. Dr. Larson.
Oh, that would be dual use of spectrum and dual use of both security and commercial applications.
Super. And Clete. Sorry, Brent, excuse me.
Yeah. I'll just close by noting, spectrum policy is very important. I don't, it's not everything. I mean, the U.S. has a lot of other benefits. And I would just say, I believe there are still win-win-win situations available when it comes to spectrum policy.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists today, Kim Larson, Clete Johnson, Jeffrey Wells, Brent Skurup. This is the National Security Institute at the George Mason University. We have been talking about 5G to 6G, international perspectives on defense and spectrum. And thank you, and please join us again. Be sure to look for NSI on Twitter and LinkedIn. You'll find this video archived, I believe, on our YouTube page, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks.